Continuing our study in 1 Corinthians, going backwards from Revelation to Genesis, favorite passages. And we're going to really skim through 3 chapters in a hurry. The first one is chapter 7, and it deals with marriage, married and single, freed by a mate versus freed by death, and all of the consequences therein. Obviously, Paul writes to us both what he says is a command from God as well as from his own opinion. And that's very important to be sure that we understand that. If God inspired every word of the Bible, then he inspired Paul's opinion as well. Nevertheless, we have very clearly the fact that when we're married, we're to stay married. When we're single, it would be better if we stayed single. When we've been freed by a mate, we should stay freed. When we've been freed by death, we should stay freed by death, but it is not a sin to remarry. And I think all of those things are very important to understand. Paul's position is predominantly writing to people who are very spiritually minded and perhaps missionary minded, and he reminds them that when you are single, you can concentrate solely upon pleasing God. When you are married, you have to concentrate not only on pleasing God, but also pleasing your mate. And you'll find that very clearly in chapter 7, verses 32 through 34. And he says in verse 34, his interests are divided. And then he also says very clearly that we have to spend special time trying to please our mates. However, he also talks very openly here about a wife bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if he is dead, she is free to marry to whom she wishes. Now, one of the points that he makes very clearly about being married and marrying again, if we should be freed, is that he doesn't want us to allow our physical desires, our fleshly desires, to become a problem for us. And if sexuality is very, very important to us, and the sharing with someone of the opposite sex is very important to us, that it's far better to be married than it is to be single and wind up struggling with those fleshly desires. I don't think there are too many people that I know that are not missionaries who don't desire to be married because they have that fleshly desire, both for companionship in its pure sense and in sexual relationship in its more lustful areas. And so we clearly see this. And I think that those that have been freed by death of a mate, who are very lonely, and perhaps the desire for companionship is even greater than the desire for sexual pleasure, they shouldn't feel guilty about remarrying. It's no disrespect to their previous mate. Their mate would always want them to be happy. That would be the more important thing than having said, I never married anybody but my husband or my wife. And so I think remarriage is something that many people stay away from because they think they're going to be displeasing to God by remarrying, or displeasing to their previous mate by remarrying. And yet I think God clearly sees the need that most of us have for companionship and for physical pleasure. So I hope that takes care of some of those issues for you. In chapter 8 we find the section on eating sacrificed foods. Not much of an issue today. We don't find a lot of religious groups sacrificing food to gods and then us turning around and eating them. So chapter 8 is probably not terribly important to most of us. other than if a food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again so that I will not cause my brother to stumble. Now, that falls in the area where we do find a little bit of problem today in our world, and that is both in the Jewish faith and also in the Islam faith. We do evidently offend both the Jew and Islam when we eat pork. Certain foods that are prohibited by their particular religious laws. However, I believe we live in a well-educated society where both Islamics and Jewish people understand that when we're not following their particular faith, that we're not deliberately just trying to offend them or to hurt their feelings. I think it's very, very important that we understand that no more than should we be offended by some of the practices that they do or the foods they abstain from. We shouldn't let that offend us, and we would hope that they would be open enough to realize that if we don't follow their faith, that they shouldn't be offended by us eating those things. That means that we should be sensitive to what's going on. I remember when I was working for a division of General Dynamics, and I was in the Fort Worth plant, and we were entertaining the Israelites that were coming to buy F-16s. That somebody in protocol really messed up in the Fort Worth plant, and we were going to sit down to a lunch of ham. And obviously that would have been very offensive to have served ham when we knew our guests were going to be of a strong Jewish faith. So we don't want to hurt our brothers and sisters or offend them deliberately, and obviously the kitchen quickly made the adjustment and the ham wasn't placed in front of the Jewish guests, but it almost happened. It almost was placed down in front of them, but somebody finally caught the mistake in protocol and corrected the problem. And I think it's important for us to not deliberately hurt anybody, whether they're a brother or whether they're not a brother. I think we should not try to hurt them. At the same time, I think that they should be understanding that if we don't follow their faith, that that's our problem. If they think it's that strong an issue that we eat those things. Chapter 9. Paul spends most of his time justifying the fact that some people will have to use ministry as their only form of support. Other people may be bivocational, and he justifies, and my comment here in chapter 9 would be that a minister should expect to work no less hard or no less diligently than the person who is paying his salary through the gifts to the church. In other words, I think it's a minister's responsibility to not be slothful, to not be a sluggard, to not take advantage of a high-paying job at the expense of his parishioners. And I know that gets very pointed at some of the celebrity preachers we have today, and even in some days, some of the mega churches and some of the other church work. I think we have to be very careful about the kind of pay we accept in the ministry. And then we come finally to chapter 10, and this is a little longer than usual devotion, but chapter 10 talks about not allowing our freedom to become a freedom to sin. And I think it's a very important chapter because it uses the Old Testament as an example, and it talks about those that were in the Old Testament that allowed the freedom that they had to become a freedom to do as they wanted, and actually rising up against the things of God. And it tells us very clearly in chapter 10, verses 11 and following, that these things were shown to us in the Old Testament as an example that we should learn from them. And And verse 12 it says, therefore let no one who thinks he stands, he better take heed because he might fall. And so we're not above being able to sin, and we need to be able to be sure that we don't go around strutting our pride, thinking that we can't possibly fall, because it warns us that may be the very time that we do fall. And verse 13 that we covered previously in one of the lessons on 1 Corinthians, no temptation has taken you, but it's such as is common to man. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with every temptation will provide a way of escape also, so that you'll be able to endure it. That's an important lesson for us to remember. If you don't have that marked in your Bible, if you don't think about that when you're tempted, you're making a bad mistake. God is very clear that he'll never tempt us above which we're able, and that with every temptation he'll make a way of escape. And that's my thought for the day. God bless you and have a great day.